Awaken your spirit, chosen ones. Some endings don't come with noise. They come with a quiet click, the kind that sounds like a case file snapping shut, sealing every lie, every move, every hidden intention inside it forever. And here's the truth most people don't realize. In real life, there is no dramatic courtroom moment where everything is exposed at once. No judge banging a gavel while everyone gasps. Most downfalls happen slowly, silently, and then all at once, when the weight of everything finally catches up. It's not cinematic, it's inevitable. And by the time people realize what's happening, it's already too late to rewrite anything. Because once the narrative collapses, once the patterns become too obvious, once the energy shifts, there's no reopening that file. No, wait, let me explain. No last-minute redemption arc. Just a quiet, undeniable conclusion that settles in people's minds like a fact nobody argues with anymore. And the funny part? The same people who were loud, confident, and fully convinced they had everything under control suddenly become very quiet. Not because they found peace, but because they ran out of angles. It's hard to keep performing when the audience has already figured out the plot twist. This is the moment no one prepares for, when everything they built starts working against them, when time stops being their ally and starts becoming evidence. And while they're still trying to manage perception, something deeper is happening. Reality is closing in. This isn't about revenge. It's not even about winning. It's about that final shift, when the truth no longer needs defending, when the story no longer needs correcting, and when everything that needed to be seen has already been seen. The case file didn't slam shut dramatically. It clicked, quiet, final, irreversible. And when that sound happened, it was already over for all of them. Number 1. The most dangerous moment wasn't when they attacked you. It was when you stopped reacting. At first, they felt powerful watching you respond. Every emotion you showed gave them feedback. Anger told them where to push harder. Frustration told them they were getting to you. Even your attempts to defend yourself gave them something to work with. It kept the cycle alive. It gave them a sense of control, like they were steering your reactions without ever touching you directly. Then something shifted. You stopped giving them anything. No explanations, no emotional outbursts. No need to correct every lie or defend every misunderstanding. And that's when everything became uncomfortable for them. Because when you stop reacting, you remove the only map they had to navigate you. Now they don't know what you're thinking, what you're planning, or even if they still matter to you at all. That kind of silence isn't peaceful for them. It's unsettling. It forces them to sit with their own actions without distraction. There's no more back and forth to hide behind. No more emotional smoke to blur what's really happening. Just a clear, quiet space where their behavior stands on its own, exposed. What makes it even harder for them is that they can't provoke you the way they used to. They might try harder at first, pushing boundaries, saying more extreme things, hoping to pull you back into the cycle. But when nothing works, when there's no reaction to grab onto, it starts to feel like they've lost access completely. And that's exactly what happened. You didn't win by overpowering them. You didn't need a final word or a dramatic exit. You simply stopped participating in something that was feeding off your energy. And once that supply was gone, everything they built around controlling you started to fall apart. That's the moment the balance shifted, quietly but completely. Number 2, they didn't lose because you won. They lost because their own narrative collapsed. What kept them standing wasn't strength, it was a story. A carefully managed version of events where you were framed a certain way and they positioned themselves as reasonable, justified, or even innocent. That story did the heavy lifting. It influenced how people saw you without them needing constant proof. It created doubt around you and comfort around them. As long as that narrative held, they felt untouchable. The problem with a false narrative is that it's high maintenance. It needs constant reinforcement, subtle adjustments, and consistent behavior to keep it believable. One contradiction might go unnoticed, two might raise eyebrows, but over time, the gaps become harder to hide. People start noticing things that don't quite add up. The tone doesn't match the actions. The details shift depending on who's listening. The confidence starts looking forced instead of natural. Meanwhile, you didn't have to keep adjusting anything. Your story didn't need editing because it wasn't built on performance. You just lived. You stayed consistent. And consistency has a way of speaking louder than any explanation. It creates a pattern people can observe without being told what to think. At some point, the weight of maintaining their version became too much. Not because they admitted anything, but because reality stopped cooperating with the image they were trying to project. The cracks showed in small ways first. Awkward moments, subtle distancing, quiet doubt from people who used to fully believe them. And once doubt enters, it spreads. That's the moment everything starts collapsing. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. People don't always announce that they've changed their minds. They just move differently. They listen less. They question more. And suddenly the same narrative that once protected them starts working against them. They didn't lose because you proved them wrong in a big, obvious way. They lost because their version of the truth couldn't survive long-term exposure to reality. And once that foundation broke, everything built on top of it came down with it. Number 3. The evidence wasn't what you said. It was how you survived. People often think proof has to be loud or dramatic to be believable. They expect explanations, arguments, or emotional displays that clearly prove innocence or truth. But real evidence doesn't always work that way. In many situations, the strongest proof is not in what someone says, but in what they continue to do when pressure doesn't break them. You didn't need long speeches or perfect wording to defend yourself. You didn't need to constantly correct every version of your name or every story being told about you. Instead, your life itself became the record. The way you kept moving forward, even when things were unfair. The way you stayed steady when it would have been easier to collapse or react. The way you continued building while others expected you to fall apart. That kind of consistency creates a quiet form of credibility. It doesn't demand attention, but it earns it over time. People start noticing patterns without being told what to think. They see who keeps changing stories and who stays the same under pressure. And in most cases, survival without distortion becomes more convincing than any explanation given. What makes this even more powerful is that you didn't perform your survival. You didn't turn it into a show for approval. You just kept going. And that removes the usual angles people try to dismiss. They can argue words, they can twist statements, but it's much harder to argue with time and consistency. While others may have expected you to break, your continued stability created a different kind of record, one that didn't need witnesses to be valid. Over time, even those who were unsure started adjusting their perception, not because they were convinced by a speech, but because reality kept repeating itself in your favor. In the end, the strongest case wasn't built in conversation. It was built in endurance. And endurance doesn't need interpretation. It simply becomes fact when it lasts long enough. Number 4. They thought time would erase what they did, but time exposed it instead. Most people misunderstand how time works when it comes to hidden actions. They assume distance automatically weakens memory, that if something is not dealt with immediately, it will slowly fade away and become irrelevant. So they wait. They delay accountability. They expect silence to do the cleaning for them. But time doesn't erase behavior. It reveals patterns that were not visible at first. At the beginning, things may look controlled. Stories are carefully managed, actions are explained away, and anything uncomfortable is pushed into the background. It might even seem like it's working for a while. No immediate consequences, no obvious fallout. That silence gets mistaken for resolution. But in reality, it's just the early stage where everything is still settling. As time moves forward, consistency starts to become unavoidable. People begin to remember details differently. Small contradictions become harder to hide because they accumulate. What was once dismissed as confusion starts to look like a pattern, and patterns are what people eventually trust more than words. The mistake they made was believing the past would stay buried just because it wasn't being discussed. But silence doesn't remove evidence, it just delays attention. And delayed attention often comes with sharper clarity because people have had time to observe more, compare more, and notice what doesn't line up. Meanwhile, your position in time kept changing in a way they didn't anticipate. You kept moving forward, while their version of events stayed frozen. That gap created distance between what they claimed and what people could actually see happening. And that gap kept widening. Eventually, time did what confrontation couldn't do. It removed urgency and replaced it with observation. It let people sit with inconsistencies long enough to recognize them without pressure. And once that recognition settled, the old narrative didn't need to be attacked. It simply stopped making sense. What they thought would fade ended up becoming clearer, not because someone forced it out, but because time made it impossible to ignore. Number 5. Their biggest mistake was assuming you needed them to collapse. One of the most dangerous assumptions people can make about someone else is believing that person's growth or stability depends on them. It creates a false sense of importance, like they are holding a key to your progress, your peace, or your direction. From that mindset, they start behaving like your presence in their life is a condition for your success or survival. So they wait. They expect you to react in ways that confirm that belief. They think pressure will bring you back. They think absence will weaken you. They think confusion will force you to seek answers from them. Everything they do is built around the idea that eventually you will need them to resolve something, explain something, or reconnect something. But that's where the misunderstanding becomes costly. Instead of depending on them, you started separating from the entire system they assumed you were tied to. You didn't announce it. You didn't argue about it. You didn't try to convince them otherwise. You simply began building in a direction that had nothing to do with their approval or involvement. That's the part they didn't prepare for, because when someone no longer reaches back, the power dynamic shifts without warning. The control they thought they had starts to disappear, not because of confrontation, but because of irrelevance. They keep acting like they still matter in your decisions, while your actions slowly prove otherwise. And the hardest part for them is realizing it too late. By the time they notice the distance is real, you're already functioning without them in any meaningful way. The emotional leverage they once relied on no longer exists. There's nothing left to pull, nothing left to influence. They didn't lose because you fought them. They lost because they were still playing a game where they believed you needed them to complete it. And you were never playing that game at all. Number 6. The real closure didn't happen in a conversation. It happened in your detachment. Most people expect closure to come in a clear moment. A final talk, a confession, an apology. Some kind of structured ending where everything is explained and both sides agree on what happened. That idea feels neat, but real life rarely works like that. In reality, closure often doesn't arrive through communication at all. It arrives when communication is no longer necessary. At first, there's usually an urge to fix things verbally, to clarify misunderstandings, to make sure your side is understood properly, to reach a point where everything feels settled through words. But words depend on willingness from both sides. And when that willingness is not equal, conversations become loops instead of endings. Nothing actually resolves, it just repeats in different forms. Detachment changes that completely. When you stop chasing explanations and stop needing validation from the situation, something important shifts. The emotional weight you are carrying starts to lose its grip because you are no longer feeding it with attention. You are no longer trying to force clarity from people who were never committed to giving it. That doesn't mean everything suddenly feels perfect or easy. It means the situation stops having authority over your inner state. The questions that once demanded answers start losing urgency. The need to be understood by certain people begins to fade. Not because you got what you wanted, but because you stopped needing it from them. And that is where real closure forms. Not in agreement, not in resolution, but in distance. In the quiet decision to stop returning to the same emotional space where nothing changes. You don't need a final conversation to close a chapter that you've already stopped reading. What others often fail to realize is that detachment doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with explanations or warnings. It simply removes your presence from something that used to define your reactions. And once that happens, the situation no longer has anything to hold on to. That is the moment the ending becomes real, even if nobody ever says a word about it. Number 7. They exposed themselves trying to prove you wrong. One of the most overlooked truths in conflict is that people rarely get fully exposed by the person they target. More often, they expose themselves through the way they react. When someone becomes obsessed with proving another person wrong, they stop paying attention to how they themselves look in the process. That's where the damage begins. At first, their goal feels simple. Discredit you, rewrite your image, control how others see the situation. So they start talking more, explaining more, adding details that sound convincing in their own head. But the more they try to strengthen their version, the more they start creating inconsistencies they don't notice. Because truth doesn't require maintenance, but distortion does. Over time, the effort to hold everything together becomes heavier. They repeat themselves in slightly different ways, hoping repetition will make it believable. They adjust small parts of the story depending on who they are talking to. They react strongly to anything that challenges their version. And in doing so, they reveal more about their intentions than they intended to. Meanwhile, you don't need to chase their narrative. You're not constantly adjusting your version or defending it in every direction. That contrast becomes noticeable to people watching from the outside, not because you're saying more, but because you're not overworking your explanation. Eventually, something shifts in perception. People begin to notice that the energy coming from them is driven by urgency, while your presence remains steady. And urgency always raises questions when compared to calm consistency. It creates curiosity. It invites comparison. The irony is that the more effort they put into convincing others, the more they start revealing emotional pressure, bias, and instability in their own approach. They think they are shaping perception, but they are actually exposing their own patterns of behavior. In trying to control how you are seen, they lose control of how they are seen. And once that happens, the focus quietly moves away from you and lands on them without you having to say a single thing. Number 8. What ended them wasn't revenge, it was irrelevance. Most people assume that endings come through confrontation, that someone has to fight back, expose everything, or deliver a final blow for closure to happen. But real endings are often much quieter and far more uncomfortable than that. They don't come from what you do to someone. They come from what you stop doing for them in your mind. Revenge keeps a connection alive. It still places importance on the other person. It still says, "You matter enough for me to respond." Even anger does that. Even arguments do that. As long as there is emotional engagement, The situation is still active. It hasn't ended. It's just changed form. Irrelevance is different. Irrelevance is when someone no longer holds a position in your decisions, reactions, or attention. It's not hatred, and it's not forgiveness. It's removal. They are no longer part of the system your mind runs on. That is far more final than any argument or retaliation. For them, this shift is difficult to detect at first, because they expect a reaction. They expect pushback. They expect some kind of emotional signal that proves they still have influence. But when that signal never comes, confusion starts building quietly. Not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing is happening at all. And that nothing becomes louder over time. They may try different approaches to regain attention. They might escalate, provoke, or revisit old dynamics, expecting a response that brings everything back into motion. But when there's no emotional return, their actions lose meaning. Without reaction, their influence has nowhere to land. Meanwhile, your absence from the emotional loop becomes the new reality. You are no longer participating in their narrative, not even as opposition. That removal changes everything because systems only function when both sides are engaged. Eventually, what remains is not conflict, not closure through confrontation, but simple disconnection. They are no longer part of your internal world, and that is where endings become permanent. Not through what was done, but through what no longer exists between you. Number 9. The people who believed them didn't betray you, they revealed themselves. It's easy to look at situations like this and focus only on who stood by you and who didn't, but that reaction often misses the deeper truth. People don't suddenly change character because of one story or one moment. They reveal what was already there. Pressure doesn't create values, it exposes them. When the situation started, some people aligned quickly with what they were told, not because they deeply investigated anything, but because it felt simpler to accept a ready-made version of events. It required less effort, less discomfort, and less uncertainty. And in many cases, people choose comfort over clarity without even realizing it. That's where the real separation begins. Those who needed certainty immediately without questioning much were not necessarily against you as a person. They were just operating from a place where surface-level understanding was enough for them. They didn't pause long enough to see inconsistencies or wait for patterns to form. They filled the gaps with assumptions instead of observation. Over time, however, consistency starts speaking louder than early impressions. Actions repeat. Behaviors stay the same. Time adds weight to what is real and exposes what was rushed. And when that happens, people begin to quietly adjust their understanding, even if they never admit it out loud. What feels like betrayal at first slowly turns into clarity, because the situation stops being about convincing people and starts becoming about recognizing who depends on quick judgment and who depends on steady evidence. And that realization is uncomfortable, but valuable. It shows you that not every opinion was rooted in understanding. Some were based on convenience. Some were influenced by emotion. Some were shaped by the need to belong to a side quickly rather than sit with uncertainty. In the end, the situation doesn't just define what happened between you and others. It reveals how people think, how they choose, and how they handle incomplete information. And that kind of revelation stays longer than the situation itself ever does. Number 10. They underestimated how quietly you were rebuilding. Most people assume that when someone is under pressure or going through conflict, their life either pauses or falls apart. They expect visible struggle, visible confusion, visible damage. What they don't expect is quiet construction happening at the same time. That's why they often misread the entire situation. While others were focused on watching, judging, or assuming what would happen next, Something else was taking place underneath all of that noise. You weren't broadcasting your process. You weren't asking for approval or updates from anyone involved in the situation. You were simply adjusting, learning, and rebuilding in a way that didn't need attention to function. That's where most people get it wrong. They think growth has to be visible to be real. But the most stable kind of rebuilding often happens without announcements. No explanations, no performances, just consistent movement in a different direction. The people watching expected signs of collapse or return. They were looking for emotional reactions, setbacks, or dependence on what was happening around you. But instead, they were met with distance. Not loud distance, but quiet distance. The kind that doesn't argue or explain itself, it just continues. And because there was nothing dramatic to point at, they assumed nothing significant was happening. That assumption became their blind spot. Meanwhile, your focus was not on proving anything to them. It was on regaining control over your own direction. That means building habits, reshaping priorities, and removing things that no longer aligned with where you were going. None of it required approval from the situation you were leaving behind. Over time, that quiet rebuilding creates a gap, not just in distance, but in capability. While some people are still analyzing your past, you are already functioning in a different version of your present. That gap becomes difficult for others to measure because they were never part of the process. By the time they notice change, it doesn't look like recovery anymore. It looks like a completely different direction altogether. And that is what they underestimated from the beginning. Number 11. The final verdict wasn't spoken. It was felt. Not every ending arrives with clear announcements or formal closure. In fact, some of the most important conclusions in life are never said out loud at all. They form quietly in people's minds through observation, repetition, and time. No meeting is needed. No argument is required. A shift happens internally, and once it happens, it doesn't need approval or discussion. At first, people often rely on what they are told. Words carry weight in the beginning, especially when they come with confidence or repetition. But words are fragile when they are not supported by consistent reality. Over time, people start comparing what they hear with what they see. And that comparison slowly changes how they interpret everything. That is where the silent verdict begins to form. It doesn't come from a single moment. It builds from small details that accumulate without forcing attention. The way situations unfold, the way responses are given, the way patterns repeat without needing explanation. People may not even realize they are forming an opinion, but they are. Quietly, naturally, without pressure. What makes this kind of verdict powerful is that it doesn't depend on agreement. It doesn't need public confirmation. It exists as a personal understanding inside each observer. That's why it spreads differently. Not through statements, but through behavior changes. People start reacting differently, even if they never say why. And once that internal shift happens, it becomes difficult to reverse. Because it is no longer about convincing anyone. It is about what has already been recognized. There is no dramatic moment where everything is officially decided. Instead, there is a point where things simply stop needing debate. The situation no longer feels uncertain to those observing it. It settles into clarity without announcement. That is what makes it final. Not noise, not confrontation, but recognition that no longer requires words. And once something reaches that stage, it no longer needs to be spoken to be understood. Number 12. They lost access, not just to you, but to the version of you they could control. Most people don't realize that what they think they are attached to in someone else is not the whole person, but a version of them that was easier to influence, predict, or manage. That version responds quickly, explains too much, stays available emotionally, and tries to fix misunderstandings immediately. It is familiar, predictable, and therefore comfortable for people who rely on control or emotional leverage. But people are not static. They shift when experience forces them to see things differently. What changed here was not just distance from others, but internal structure. The way you respond, the way you interpret situations, and the way you decide where your energy goes all began to shift. Slowly at first, then clearly over time. And with that shift, the old version of you stopped being accessible. That is what confuses people the most. They still interact with you mentally as if the old patterns should apply. They expect explanations where there are none. They expect emotional availability where there is restraint. They expect access to reactions that no longer exist. But what they are trying to reach is no longer active, and because they cannot find that familiar response anymore, they assume something is wrong or missing. But nothing is missing. It has simply changed form. This is where control breaks down without confrontation. There is no moment where you announce that access is revoked. It happens through behavior, through silence in situations that used to create reaction, through calm where there used to be emotional movement, through decisions that no longer require external input. Over time, that change becomes irreversible in practice, not because of force, but because repetition confirms it. Every attempt to return to the old dynamic meets a different version of you, and eventually, even expectation starts to adjust. What they truly lose is not your presence, but the predictability of your responses. And without that predictability, influence disappears quietly. What remains is awareness that the version they once knew no longer responds the same way, and may not respond at all in the ways they remember. Number 13. You didn't move on, you moved out of their narrative entirely. People often use the phrase moving on as if it means carrying the same story forward with less pain. But that's not what really happens when someone fully breaks out of a situation that once defined them. Real change is not about continuing the story differently. It is about stepping outside of the story completely. At first, you are part of what others are saying, thinking, and assuming. Your name, your actions, and your situation are all placed inside a narrative that other people repeat, adjust, and interpret. That narrative gives them a way to categorize you, even if it is inaccurate or incomplete. It becomes a framework they rely on. But at some point, something shifts internally. You stop responding to that framework, not through argument or correction, but through distance. You no longer operate inside the space where their version of events has influence over your decisions or emotional state. That is the key difference most people miss. You are no longer reacting to what is being said. You are no longer adjusting yourself based on how you are being seen. And slowly that removes you from the structure entirely. A narrative only survives when the person inside it continues to engage with it, directly or indirectly. Without engagement, it loses its function. What makes this so powerful is that from the outside, it might still look like you are part of the story. People may still talk as if the old version applies, but internally, there is no longer any connection to that version. It stops influencing how you move, how you think, and how you respond, and that is where the real separation happens. You are not correcting the narrative anymore because you are not living inside it. You are not trying to be understood within it because it no longer defines your reality. It continues only in the minds of those still attached to it, while you have already stepped beyond its boundaries entirely. That is not moving forward within a story. That is leaving the story itself behind. Number 14. It's over for all of them doesn't mean destruction. It means disconnection. People often misunderstand endings because they expect something dramatic to confirm them. They expect downfall, exposure, arguments, or visible consequences that mark a clear finish. But real endings are not always loud. In fact, the most complete endings are often the quietest ones because they don't depend on emotion anymore. Disconnection is not about what happens to others. It is about what no longer happens between you and them. There is no longer exchange that carries weight, no emotional reaction that keeps the loop alive, no need to revisit the same space mentally or emotionally. The connection that once created tension, confusion, or attention simply stops being active, and that is what most people fail to understand. They think closure means something has to be fixed or resolved between both sides. But disconnection doesn't require agreement. It doesn't require understanding. It doesn't require anyone to admit anything. It just requires one thing: the absence of continued access. When that access ends, everything else starts to lose importance on its own. What used to feel emotionally charged becomes distant. What used to trigger reaction becomes irrelevant. Even memories start to lose their emotional grip because they are no longer reinforced by ongoing interaction or attention. From the outside, people might still assume there is a connection because history exists. But history alone doesn't maintain influence. Only continued engagement does. Without that, even strong past experiences begin to fade in their ability to affect the present. That is why this kind of ending feels so final. Not because something was destroyed, but because nothing is being sustained anymore. There is no energy going into maintaining the link, no emotional investment keeping it alive, no return to the same cycle. What remains is simply distance without resistance, and that is the most irreversible form of separation, not because of conflict, but because nothing is left that needs to continue. In the end, the real message behind everything is simple, even if it doesn't feel simple while you're living it. Most of what people call conflict, misunderstanding, betrayal, or control is not actually held together by strength. It is held together by attention, reaction, and emotional participation. The moment those things start disappearing, the entire structure begins to change without needing force or confrontation. What we've been looking at isn't about dramatic wins or visible revenge. It's about how situations quietly lose their power when they are no longer fed. When reactions stop, narratives weaken. When narratives weaken, people start relying on observation instead of assumption. When observation takes over, truth no longer needs defending. It just becomes clear over time. And that is the part most people miss. They expect closure to come through noise, through explanations, through final words that settle everything once and for all. But real closure rarely works that way. It comes through distance, through consistency, through stepping out of emotional loops that no longer serve any purpose. It comes when something that once felt heavy simply stops having authority over your present state. What makes this case file snapped shut idea so powerful is not the idea of punishment or collapse. It is the realization that access itself can end quietly. Not because something was forced, but because something was no longer sustained. Once that access is gone, everything built around it naturally loses structure. There is nothing left to argue with, nothing left to correct, and nothing left to emotionally engage. And when that point is reached, the ending is not dramatic. It is final in a calmer, more permanent way. The kind of finality that doesn't need confirmation because it is already reflected in how life continues without interruption from the past. If this resonated with you, don't just watch and move on. Subscribe to the channel for more deep, thought-provoking content like this. Like the video if it gave you clarity, comment your thoughts if it sparked something in you, and share it with someone who needs to hear a different perspective today. Stay awakened, chosen ones.